A man sits beside a charcoal fire on the edge of a lake at dawn. The smoke drifts low over the water. The smell of burning wood and fish fills the cold morning air. He has been out all night, caught nothing. And now there is a stranger on the shore who somehow knows where the fish are, and somehow knew his name before he gave it, and somehow, 3 years ago, looked at this same man rough-handed, loud, impulsive, the kind of man who speaks before he thinks and said, "Follow me." Peter follows. He always follows. But 3 days before this morning, in a courtyard not far from here, beside another charcoal fire, the only other charcoal fire in all 4 Gospels, this same man was asked a simple question by a servant girl. Not a soldier, not a priest, a girl. "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter said no, 3 times. We are going to come back to that beach. We are going to come back to that fire and to that question and to what Jesus says to Peter in the minutes that follow. But not yet. First, we need to talk about questions. Jesus of Nazareth asked approximately 307 questions across the 4 Gospels. 307. He was asked 183 questions in return, and he directly answered fewer than 10. Think about that. He deflected, he redirected, he answered questions with questions. He told stories instead of giving explanations. He said things like, "What do you think?" and "Have you not read?" and "Who touched me?" in a crowd of hundreds, as though he genuinely did not know. He always knew. This is not the teaching method of a philosopher gathering data. In the 1st century, Jewish rabbis taught through a method called shi'alot questions, but the purpose was to test what a student already knew, to draw out knowledge, to sharpen the mind. Jesus did something different. His questions were not tests. They were not traps, though some people thought so. They were not requests for information he was missing. Every question Jesus asked was aimed at something happening inside the person being asked. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, documented the world Jesus moved through the overcrowded streets of Galilee, the sick lying at the gates of Jerusalem, the desperate poor who had been waiting for a healer, a liberator, a Messiah. For so long that hope had curdled in some of them into something that looked more like habit than faith. These were not people with easy lives. These were people who had learned to expect nothing and protect themselves from disappointment. And into that world, Jesus walked, and he asked questions, not because he needed the answers, because the people he was asking did. The Sea of Galilee is not a gentle body of water. It sits in a basin surrounded by hills, and the geography does something unusual. Cold air from the plateau to the east can drop into that basin without warning, colliding with the warm, humid air above the lake and producing storms that rise in minutes. Local fishermen knew this. They had grown up on this water. They had read its moods the way other men read faces. When the disciples got into that boat with Jesus, they were not nervous tourists. Andrew and Peter and James and John had spent their lives on this lake. If they were afraid, the storm was worth being afraid of. And Jesus was asleep. He was asleep in the stern of the boat, his head on a cushion, a detail so specific, so human, that it has always stopped me while the waves broke over the sides and the water rose around their feet. The disciples woke him, not calmly. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" That is not a polite question. That is the sound of men who have passed the edge of fear and landed somewhere closer to accusation. Jesus stands up. He speaks to the wind. He speaks to the water. And the wind stops, and the water goes flat, a great calm. Mark calls it a stillness so complete that it was apparently more frightening than the storm. And then he turns to his disciples, and he asks a question. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? Here's what most people miss. He doesn't say I was right here the whole time. You should have known better. He doesn't give a sermon on trust. He doesn't explain what just happened. He asks a question, and then he leaves it hanging in the air above that flat, still water, in the silence where a storm used to be. Why are you afraid? These men were afraid because the boat was sinking. That is a rational reason to be afraid. Jesus knows this. He is not confused about the physics of the situation, but the question he asks is not about the storm. It is about something underneath the storm, something in them that the storm had simply revealed. Fear, in this moment, is not the problem. Fear is the symptom. The question goes to the root, and this is what Jesus does again and again. Across 307 questions, he asks what is on the surface so that the person being asked has to sit with what is underneath. You cannot answer, why are you afraid, without looking at your fear. You cannot look at your fear without starting to understand it. And you cannot understand it without just beginning to wonder if maybe the man standing in the stern of your boat has something to say about it. He does not demand an answer. He plants the question like a seed, and he moves on. The pool of Bethesda was in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, and if you had gone there on any ordinary morning in the first century, what you would have seen would have stayed with you. Hundreds of sick people, blind men and lame women, and people whose bodies had stopped working in ways that had no name. They lay on covered colonnades around the pool's edge, 5 of them, John tells us. Porches full of people who had nothing left to do but wait. The belief was that an angel sometimes stirred the water, and the first person into the pool when the water moved would be healed. Whether this was true or not, the people who lay there believed it. And belief, when you have been sick for long enough, is the only currency you have left. Jesus walks in. He does not heal everyone. He walks through hundreds of suffering people, and he stops in front of one man. This man has been ill for 38 years. 38 years. Think about what that means. He has not walked since before most of the people around him were born. He has outlasted hope in the ordinary sense of the word. He has made a life out of waiting, and it has not worked. Because whenever the water stirs, there is nobody to carry him in, and someone always gets there first. Jesus looks at this man. The text says he knew he had been there a long time. Of course he knew. He always knows. And he asks, do you want to be healed? Stay with me. Because this is the question that sounds absurd on the surface. The man is lying beside a healing pool. He has been sick for 38 years. Do you want to be healed? What else would he want? But the Greek word here is thaleis from thelo, and it does not mean passive longing. It does not mean, do you wish things were different? It means, do you actively will this? Is your whole self oriented toward this? Do you want with the full weight of that word to get up? Because some people, after 38 years, have reorganized their entire lives around their wound. Their identity lives inside the illness. The question's not cruel. It is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to this man. Do you want to be healed, or do you want to stay here, where at least you understand the rules? And here's the part nobody tells you. The man does not say yes. He says, sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. He answers the question with an excuse, a reasonable excuse, an honest excuse, a 38-year-old excuse, but an excuse. Jesus does not argue with him. He says, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And the man gets up. This is the mercy inside the question. Jesus already knew the man would deflect. He asked anyway, not because he needed a clean answer before he would act, but because the man needed to hear himself not answer. He needed to feel the gap between what Jesus was offering and what he was actually reaching for. And in that gap, in the silence between the question and the excuse, something shifted, something moved, something that had been still for 38 years. The question did not require an answer. It required a moment of honesty. There is a place in northern Israel, at the foot of Mount Hermon, where a spring once poured out of a massive cliff face and disappeared into the earth through a cave so dark and so deep that the people who lived there believed it was literally the entrance to the underworld. They called it Panias. The Greeks renamed it Caesarea Philippi. And they built temples there, temples to Pan, temples to Caesar, niches carved into the rock face where statues of gods stood watching the water. This is where Jesus takes his disciples and asks the most important question in the Gospels. Not in the temple, not in a synagogue, not in some sacred place set apart from the noise of the world. He walks his disciples to a pagan shrine, to a place the Jewish people called Baal Hermon, the dwelling of a foreign god, to a cliff that an entire culture believed was the mouth of death itself. And standing there, with those carved niches full of stone gods behind him, he asks, "Who do people say I am?" The disciples answer comfortably, "John the Baptist." They say, "Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets." Then he sharpens it. "But who do you say I am?" And this is where Peter, the same man who will later deny him 3 times beside a charcoal fire, the same man sitting on that beach at dawn, Peter opens his mouth and says something that no disciple had ever said to a rabbi, that no student had ever said to a teacher, that perhaps no human being had ever said out loud to another human being standing in front of them in the flesh, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And this is where it gets remarkable. Jesus does not say correct. He does not say, "Finally, you understand." He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." The question was never a quiz. It was an invitation to say out loud what Peter had been quietly thinking for months. Jesus asked the question so that the answer could move from the inside of Peter's chest to the outside, so that Peter could hear himself say it and know that he had said it and be held accountable by his own words when things got hard, which they would. And sometimes the question Jesus asks is gentle. Sometimes it is barely above a whisper. 3 days after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene is standing outside an empty tomb in the dark, crying. She has looked inside and seen 2 angels and is apparently too grief-destroyed to be startled by this. She turns around. There is a man standing there. She thinks it is the gardener. He asks her 2 questions. "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" He already knows why she is weeping. He already knows who she is seeking. He is the one she is seeking. He is standing right in front of her. He asks anyway, because grief needs somewhere to go. Because the question is not a request for information. It is a door. And the moment she hears her own name, Mary, she stops looking for the gardener and sees who is actually there. The question opened the space. The name closed it. Now we go back to the beach. The charcoal fire, the smoke drifting low over the water. Peter, who has spent the hours since the resurrection in a fog that does not have a clean name, not quite grief, not quite shame, not quite hope, but some weather system made of all three pressing down on him at once. He had said he would die before he denied Jesus. He had meant it when he said it. And then a servant girl asked him a question beside a fire, and he said no. And she asked again, and he said no again. And someone else asked, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And Peter said no for the third time. And the rooster crowed, and Jesus turned and looked at him from across the courtyard. That look, Peter does not describe that look anywhere in Scripture, but it went into him like a blade. He went outside and wept bitterly. And that is the last we hear of Peter until Easter morning, a single line in Mark's gospel, where the angel at the empty tomb says, "Go, tell his disciples," and Peter, as if Peter needed to be called out by name, as if the angel knew that Peter would not assume the invitation applied to him. Now it is morning. Now it is this beach. Now it is this fire. Jesus has already cooked breakfast. He has already said, "Come and eat." Nobody asked who he was. John tells us they knew. And after breakfast, in the quiet that follows, Jesus turns to Peter and he asks a question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He uses the name Simon, not Peter, the name Jesus gave him, the name that means rock. Simon, the old name, the name before the calling, and the word he uses for love is agape, the highest form, the unconditional, the love that costs everything. Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." But the word Peter uses is phileo affection, brotherly warmth, the love between friends. He cannot bring himself to say agape, not after what he did. Jesus asks again, same question, same word agape. "Do you love me?" With everything Peter says phileo again. "Lord, you know I love you." And then here is where it breaks open. Jesus asks a third time, but this time he comes down to Peter's level. This time he uses Peter's word. "Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? Do you even love me as a friend?" And Peter is grieved. John says he was grieved because Jesus asked him the third time. One question for each denial, one question for each fire. Jesus is not rubbing Peter's face in his failure. He is walking him back through it, one question at a time, giving him 3 chances to say yes, where he had said no, giving him a way to carry the restoration in his own mouth, in his own words, where the denial used to live. This is what the questions of Jesus do. They do not shame. They do not lecture. They do not stand at a distance and point at what you did wrong. They come down to your level. They use your word. They ask again, and they wait. 307 questions, and not one of them required an answer he didn't already have. So why did he ask? Here is the first thing to take with you. His questions were never about information. They were about invitation. Every time Jesus asked a question, he was opening a door, not demanding that you walk through it, not standing with arms crossed, waiting for the right answer, but opening a door and stepping back and letting you choose what to do with the space he had just made. "Why are you afraid?" is not a rebuke. It is a door. "Do you want to be healed?" is not obvious. It is an invitation to want something different than what you have settled for. Here is the second thing. The question he keeps asking you is probably the one you keep answering with an excuse. The man at Bethesda had a 38-year-old excuse, a good one, a true one, a reasonable one. But an excuse is still a way of not answering the question. And Jesus, with infinite patience, stands there with the question still open. He does not take the excuse as a final answer. He heals the man anyway. And then quietly, without fanfare, he lets the question sit there in the man's chest for the rest of his life. Do you want to be healed? What are you reaching for? Actually. And here is the third thing, the one that matters most. He asks because he wants to hear you say it, not because he needs to hear it, not because the answer changes anything on his end, but because something happens in you when you say out loud the thing you have only been carrying silently. Peter could have lived the rest of his life with a private, interior restoration, a quiet sense that somehow he was forgiven. Maybe, if he was lucky. Instead, Jesus gave him a public, spoken, repeated, 3 times over restoration. 1 yes for each no. 1 open declaration of love for each denial. So that Peter would never be able to wonder whether it was real, would never be able to second guess what happened on that beach, would never be able to claim he hadn't said it. He asked because he wanted Peter to hear himself say yes. He is still asking. Whatever question Jesus has been planting in you, the one that surfaces in the quiet moments, the one you deflect with reasonable explanations, the one you avoid because you are not entirely sure you want to know your own answer. He already knows the answer. He is not asking for his sake. He is asking for yours. The charcoal fire has gone cold on that beach in Galilee, but the question is still warm. What do you say?